The sixth word is from John chapter 19, verses 30 through 37. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Since it was the day of preparation, the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because that Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and the bodies removed. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. He who saw this has testified so that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. These things occurred so that the scripture might be fulfilled. None of his bones shall be broken. And again, another passage of scripture says, "They will look on the one whom they have pierced." I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept faith. It is finished. I wonder, could the soldiers hear the positive certainty, the confidence of work well completed, as they heard the voice of the dying man whose clothes they had just divided among themselves? Or did the soldiers hear those words as ones of despair and resignation? What about the faithful disciples, Jesus' family, those who were standing at the foot of the cross? Could they hear the sound of assurance, the sound of promise fulfilled in those final words of one they loved? Or did they hear sorrow and exhaustion, hear the sound of their own grief and loss? I wonder what the crowds heard, those passers-by, the curious and the indifferent. What did they hear when Jesus spoke these words? "It is finished." I know it's hard for me to hear the sound of achievement and success in these words on this day when I want to weep. I hear the finality in the words, that's clear. But in the shadow of the cross, in a year of pandemic, when the inequity and injustice of the world are so exposed, a time when I may feel worn or lonely, times when grief or loss weigh heavily in our bodies, times when the future is uncertain, in those times it is easy to hear the sadness of what is final. It's easy to hear the finishing as the end of hope. After all, that is what Rome designed the cross for in the first place. The cross, crucifixion, was purposely meant to erase the crucified from human memory, to silence opposition hopes. This, after all, is what the political leaders of the temple had in mind when they asked the Roman governor to get rid of Jesus for them. But that is not what John wants us to hear today. It's not what Jesus wants us to hear. That day when he lifts his head and declares to us, to the world, to the Father, "It is finished. It's complete. Here and now, the work of God is done. Fully and well, it is done." Jesus declares fulfillment. And John has filled this scene with little details that reinforce the sense of achievement, the success, the assurance of these words that Jesus speaks in the moment of his death. From very early in his gospel record, John has been reporting to us that Jesus tells us his purpose, the reason he came here, is to finish God's work. Jesus has come to complete and fulfill what God desires and what God does among us. So today, when Jesus declares it is finished, it is in order to remind those listening, to remind you and me that this is God's work, not the Romans' work, not the temple leaders' work, not your work or my work, but God's work that Jesus is doing in that final breath. There's a quiet dignity about the way that John narrates all the details in this scene. He speaks, he writes with simplicity and purposefulness, no hint of anguish or regret in the story. Jesus declares God's work complete, bows his head, and hands over his spirit. No one takes his life from him in that moment. Not the Romans, not the crowds around, not the temple leaders, not you or me or the masked sins of history. No one takes it from him. He said this earlier to the Pharisees and to his followers. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this command from my Father. I believe that John intends that you and I hear the Good Shepherd's presence and promise in Jesus' final words, in his last dying action. Because the death of Jesus in this way, in dignity, in purpose, as he pours out the gift of life, echoing with symbols of righteousness, this is reliable testimony, John tells us. This is told in order that you and I may believe. And by believe, he means not just accept the facts of how this happened, but believe, actually join ourselves to Jesus, to actually participate actively in Jesus' connection with God. That's the whole reason that John tells Jesus' story at all. He tells it in order that you and I might join the story ourselves. So today, anytime when you and I stand at the foot of the cross, today, anytime we are overshadowed by loss and sorrow, anytime we are overshadowed by oppression and heartbreak, you and I can hear and know from Jesus' words that God's work is completed right in the middle of all that sorrow or oppression or whatever it can bring, in the middle of all that seems to defeat God's will. Here, now, God's purpose is and has been fully accomplished. And there is no power on earth, there is no loss that we may experience that can erase or defeat what God has done. That's not always a comfort, necessarily. This knowledge that God's work is done will not always erase the heartbreak, make evil disappear from our world or our lives, or banish all pain. Instead, this assurance that God's work is completed, that is the rock that we stand on when we encounter grief or evil or pain. You know, I know that all of us are in our lives going to come face to face with loss. Someone beloved to us will die. An injury or an illness will take away a joy or a comfort. A pandemic is going to block opportunities and celebrations and the gathering for funerals. You know, I know, we're all at some point in our lives, if not regularly, we're going to experience evil. Systems of this world are going to sell the vulnerable for profit. They are going to work to spread violence and fear, to corrupt and destroy, to separate us from one another, to separate us from our hope. But on this rock of assurance, evil and loss cannot sweep us away. From the cross that is the symbol of the powers of evil, Jesus gives you and me, all of us, a place to plant our feet and root our spirit so that fear and grief and malice cannot overcome us, cannot sweep us away. Yes, God's work is complete, both then and now. You and I may not see the whole of it with our own eyes in our lifetimes. In our lives, we may not find the full and final fruits of God's salvation of the world in our day-to-day life. You and I may not experience universal holiness of the world, a vibrant and active peace that fills the globe. We may not experience the diverse human unity that God dreams for us, or all of God's other dreams that will change our day-to-day world. We may not experience all that for ourselves, but still we know that God's work is completed. That no loss, no evil, no pain can keep the fullness of salvation from us and from God's world. Now, already we know that God's will be done, both with us and in us and for the whole world. We see and hear that truth in this moment as Jesus gives his life, gives the life that cannot be taken from him by any other. And this rock we stand on reveals to us another truth, the truth that you and I also have the power to give our lives, to give our spirits in the same free and unforced way that Jesus does. I know that often the world around us tells us that our lives are not in fact our own. The press of expectations, the obligations of work, society, school, family, and commerce, these push at us. They tug away at your ability to control your time, at my ability to direct my attention. Forces like fire and flood, wind and water, economic forces, these change the world that we've tried to build for ourselves, or they physically move us around. And then there are the forces of history and greed that are expressed as privilege and oppression and various isms. The forces that subtly determine where we live, who we're friends with, what we do, and how likely we are to be killed by violence, to have our taxes audited, or to run a Fortune 500 company. Accidents injure us. Diseases take hold of our bodies. And navigating healing and health can sometimes feel like a foggy mystery of guess and hope and helplessness. We do not control our own death. The world tells us that we do not belong to ourselves, but still, you and I, like Jesus, always have the power to give our lives, to lay them down in God's work by our own choice, by our own love. Just like Jesus, our part in God's work cannot be taken from us or ended by the forces of the cross, not by fear, not by oppression or evil or anger or malice. This is a promise of freedom. Even when those forces around us seem to overwhelm us, even when the news exhausts me, when getting through the day is too much for you, in those times, and in times of joy, in all of those, we are free. We have the power to give our spirits, to give our lives into God's hands. We have the power at any time and at all times to place our whole selves in the full, completed work of God, the life-giving victory that nothing can take away from us. We see it in Jesus in one moment on the cross, but for you and me, it happens not just once, but over and over. Whenever we choose to give our lives to God's work. So every day, you and I will have a chance to say with Jesus, I have finished the race. I have kept faith. I have finished my part this day in God's completed and unerasable work of salvation for all the world. It is completed, Jesus tells us. God's work is fulfilled now, already, here. It is finished. for good.
Judgment hall, you the Lord of life arrayed, for the wormwood and the gall, for the pangs his soul sustained. Shall not suffering, shame, or loss learn of him to bear the cross? Calvary's mournful mountain God, there adoring at his feet, mark that miracle of joy, God's own sacrifice complete. It is finished.